And they're off. Just about every major space agency on the planet has decided that this is the prize that they're going to pursue. Yeah, the moon is on the list as well, but really, this is the final destination for just about everybody. I mean, we've got a probe going there this year, the Chinese have a probe going there, even the United Arab Emirates do as well, and the European Space Agency is sending a probe to Mars in 2 years. Clearly, this is the prize, and everybody has their own ideas on how to get there. First on the list, obviously, is NASA, and they, of course, have had the same idea for quite some time. This antiquated and inefficient, non-reusable piece of junk seems to be their current plan, at least in part, in how to get to the red planet. Although, to be quite honest, given all of the trouble that they've had so far in trying to get this thing operational just going to the moon, I frankly do not understand how they're going to get to Mars with this. In my view, this rocket already, unless it somehow continues to be funded by Congress year after year, needs to be crossed off the list. This is as far as the SLS is going to get to Mars. And sadly, it looks like that the Chinese and the Russians also intend to use wasteful, expendable rockets, though they might be a little cheaper, who knows. But fortunately, to the rescue comes SpaceX, as we all know, and their Starship. Whatever final shape this vessel finally takes, this is our last and best hope to get to the red planet and establish a sustainable human presence there for many years to come. But even before the Starship lifts off, we need to ask ourselves, is this the best destination, the best first destination for the Starship? Or do we have another alternative that might make it a lot easier and a lot more efficient to establish a sustained presence on Mars if that's what we intend to do? Is going directly to Mars really the best option? Or should we be looking at a different target? Now, this target is neither big nor is it glamorous, as you can see here. It just looks like an asteroid of some kind. But it's far more than that. This is Phobos, the largest of Mars' 2 moons, and although some argue that it is a captured asteroid, we're actually not very certain about that. There's some strong arguments to indicate that it isn't, but more importantly, this could possibly represent the most important and critical target that we could possibly have if we want to establish a presence on Mars. This is Mars Station Alpha, and we're going to talk about that right now. Good evening, and welcome to another episode of the Angry Astronaut. Tonight, as you can gather from the intro, we're going to be talking about Mars Station Alpha, or whatever we end up deciding to call it. Another word for it, obviously, is the traditional name for this little moon, which is Phobos. Phobos I've talked about in a little bit of detail in the past in terms of it being a natural refueling station for the Starship, both in terms of refueling on its way out, but more importantly, for the Starship on its way to Mars in order to have a full tank of fuel to execute a powered landing on the surface of Mars, being far safer. But in addition to that, there's a lot of other advantages that a base on Phobos would have to offer. It's a lot easier to transition cargo to and from the Martian surface if you can do it up to a station just a few thousand kilometers up in orbit, as opposed to all the way back to Earth. That's one of many advantages that Phobos has to offer, but there are other things besides. This moon and also Deimos, which is very frequently forgotten, smaller and orbiting a lot further out, that still need to be uncovered. In many ways, the mysteries and unknowns about these two moons are as significant as the planet that they orbit. And we owe it to ourselves, if we are going to colonize this planet, to uncover these secrets and these mysteries as much as we owe it to ourselves to explore the planet itself. However, there are extreme challenges involved besides just matching Phobos' orbit. It orbits the planet 3 times a day. It hurtles across the Martian sky. That would be something else to see. But there are challenges beyond that future Martian explorers are going to have to face if they want to set up this future base on Phobos, or indeed even on Deimos as well. So we're going to be talking about that and getting into detail about these often forgotten, very small moons of Mars, and we're going to talk about it right now. Given how close Phobos is to Mars, only 9,300 kilometers away, we know surprisingly little about this mysterious moon. The Mars Express, as you can see in the gray orbit, the highly elliptical orbit there, made a very close approach and gave us a fair amount of information, although left us with more questions than we had answers. For one thing, we're not certain about the composition at all. Although the surface is incredibly dry, the density suggests that Phobos cannot be made up of solid rock, but rather a mixture of rock and ice, very much like a C-class asteroid. And if only a small percentage of this moon is made up of water ice, that would be a huge advantage to future explorers. In fact, if only 3% of Phobos' mass is made up of water ice, we're talking 1/3 of a trillion metric tons of water ice in total. An unbelievable amount of resources when we're talking about rocket fuel, breathable atmosphere, and of course, water for the inhabitants. Water ice also serves as extremely good defense against radiation. Only a few centimeters are necessary. The delta V requirements of reaching Phobos are also lower than that of reaching Mars. And in case you're wondering what delta V actually means, it's just the change in velocity. Every object in the solar system is in motion, and so delta V is the change in velocity necessary in order to get from one body to another, although gravity has a great deal to do with that, and that's why it requires so much delta V to get from Earth to low Earth orbit. Our incredibly high gravity from Earth is one of the biggest drawbacks that this planet has to offer when it comes to exploring the solar system. Delta V can also be modified by a planet's atmosphere, either by using the atmosphere to land, as in the Starship suicide dive, or by aerobraking to reduce your speed without having to use any propellant before you either land on the surface or rendezvous with a satellite like Phobos. The best scenario would be to load the Starship up with a full tank of fuel so that it can decelerate sufficiently before arriving at Phobos. But apart from pure convenience, we need to visit Phobos and Deimos in person because of another big factor. We don't know where the hell these things came from. although some astronomers think that because of their dark coloring and the fact that they bear such a resemblance to C-class asteroids that must be what they are, is captured asteroids, their orbital patterns are very erratic and unusual, which seems to debunk the whole concept of them being captured bodies, which leads other astronomers to believe that they're actually part of Mars, ejected by some sort of collision, whereas others tend to think that these might actually be some sort of generation ships or the ancient remnants of such. By the way, I don't subscribe to that last theory. There are even more mysteries about these asteroids or moons or whatever they are, but nevertheless, let's get down to how we would build Mars Station Alpha. My favorite proposal comes from the University of Vermont, and it plans to use a very simple type of base in order to establish our presence on Phobos. Now, the core of this base is the Bigelow Aerospace Olympus module, and I know Bigelow's defunct, but the technology is still very much alive, and this module weighs 65 to 70 metric tons and can carry 2,250 cubic meters of pressurized volume. Absolutely gigantic and more than sufficient for the crew of 12 that's intended for this base. Now, aside from the Olympus, the base also has an observation tower, which includes an astrobiology lab that's attached to the Olympus, but entirely separate. And personally, I think they did that for purposes of security, because it might be entirely possible that they find life on this moon, and if so, they want to keep it isolated from the rest of the base. More on that later. Now, the Olympus was obviously designed to be a space station, but it serves the purpose of a Phobos base quite well. The central column is used for electronics, life support, and transportation between the levels, and each level has its own bedrooms, laboratories, and other rec rooms, plus hydroponic gardens necessary for the crew's survival. Everything is pretty much included to make this a self-sufficient base, plus it has an attached landing pad for visiting ships, although vessels would not necessarily set down on the pad, but rather simply be tethered to it because of the very low gravity on Phobos. So how do we build this thing? Well, sometime in October of 2023, an SLS Block 2 launches the observatory tower, the module joint, and the spaceport pad. Wait a minute, I did something wrong there. Oh yeah, screw the SLS, wait a minute. Just give me a second. Okay, I'm feeling better now. So what actually happens is the first batch, which includes the observatory tower and the module joint, etc., is launched on a lunar Starship, and that would be in October of 2024 and makes its way towards Mars. At the same time, another lunar Starship launches with the Bigelow Olympus, and then it starts to inflate it in low Earth orbit. Now, the reason you want it in low Earth orbit is because you're going to send up a Falcon 9 with a Crew Dragon on board, at least theoretically, in order to check out the systems on the Olympus before you send it all the way to Mars. So once the astronauts have completely checked out the Olympus and made sure that everything is kosher on board, then the Olympus can either be loaded back onto the Starship or preferably coupled with its own interplanetary system. Because keep in mind, the Olympus was designed to be an interplanetary ship and space station of its own, so it could be used for this purpose as long as all it had was cargo and no humans on board to worry about the relatively longer transit time of about 8 to 9 months. But regardless, the launch date would be sometime in 2026, and the arrival time would be in 2027. Now in November of 2027, the Olympus docks with the module joint and logistics are checked before astronauts are sent. Now in the original plan, they have to send 2 groups of astronauts, one in 2029 and the other in 2031, because of the damn Orion and SLS, but you don't have to do that. Instead, you can send all 12 astronauts to Phobos, and in addition to that, perhaps send starships with cargo to Mars itself in the same group, thus completing the entire maneuver by 2029. So, in theory, you could have the beginnings of a colony on Mars in 2029 and the beginnings of a base on Phobos in the same year. And if there's a failure with the landing in 2029 on Mars, then at least you still have the base in place for a future attempt under more controlled circumstances. Life on a base like this would be both difficult and magnificent. The view of Mars would be astonishing, 6,400 times larger and 2,500 times brighter than the full moon appears to us, taking up a full quarter of the width of the night sky. I can't even begin to imagine what something like that would look like. This picture just does not do it enough justice. But the dangers represented to astronauts on this base cannot be overstated, from high levels of radiation to microgravity, which would not only be inconvenient and damaging to the human body, but also would run risk of sending an astronaut tumbling helplessly off into space if the wrong amount of force were applied. But there are a lot of advantages too. It would be easy to transition cargo and personnel from the Martian surface to Phobos, and easier still to transition that cargo to a waiting starship. And by the way, you've noticed that I've used lunar starship all the time, because there would be no need for the starship to enter the atmosphere. You could use smaller rockets to transition cargo and personnel to Phobos, and then transition that cargo and personnel to the starship. But on top of that, Phobos could also be used as sort of a catapult or a trebuchet to escape Mars's gravity. As you can see from this map, a tether extended from Phobos could actually allow a ship to escape Mars gravity without having to use any propellant at all. The advantages represented by a Phobos base are difficult to keep track of. But perhaps the most compelling reason to have a Phobos base is the possibility of the discovery of life. Yes, that's right, life. Because there are types of bacteria that can survive extreme cold and vacuum here on Earth that theoretically could end up on Phobos as well, simply because so much material is shared between Phobos and Mars as a result of meteorite impacts on Mars and vice versa. What an irony that would be for the first alien life to be discovered on a tiny little moon like Phobos. But both Phobos and Deimos have one more curve to throw at astronauts who intend to set up a base, and that's their particular relationship with the solar wind. Both Phobos and Deimos are tidally locked, meaning that the same side constantly faces Mars during their orbit, and the day side, that is the side facing the sun, is constantly bombarded by the solar wind, and the night side, that is the side facing Mars, is not, and the solar wind sweeps around the moons in a peculiar way, creating an electrostatic charge that can be quite intense and can build up over time. This is not necessarily dangerous to astronauts, but it could be incredibly damaging to sensitive electronic equipment, which would be very bad news to anybody trying to set up a base on the night side, which coincidentally is the most convenient place to set up a base if you want to transition equipment to and from the Martian surface. So, we're going to have to come up with ways of discharging this static electricity or insulating our equipment against it to avoid a disaster for the brave astronauts who decide to inhabit a base on this mysterious moon of this mysterious planet. Nevertheless, we humans like a challenge, and I think we're going to be up to this particular challenge as well. I certainly would be. Having a view of Mars like this every single day while I'm on the job, at least for a year or two, would be something difficult to turn down. You know, what I find especially compelling about Mars in general, and also its moons, are the things that we don't know rather than the things that we do. In spite of all of the orbiters, in spite of all the expeditions that we've sent to this mysterious world, more expeditions than to any other destination in the solar system, we still know so little. There's so many things we still don't understand, and so many things yet to uncover. And the only way that we're going to be able to do that is with a manned expedition. We've tried rovers, we've tried orbiters, we've tried robots of every type and description, and we've got more on the way. And yet I am convinced that once the data is back from all of these missions that we have arriving in 2021, it's going to leave us once again with more questions than we have answers. And if we want to colonize this planet or its moons, then we need to make damn sure that we understand as much as possible about this strange place as we can. Not necessarily before we go, but still in the process of going, we definitely need to learn more. So in any event, the only way that we're going to be able to do that, as I've said before, is with a manned expedition. Robots can only tell us so much, and we need to be on our way. We should have been on our way decades ago, and that's been pissing me off for a long time, as I suspect it's made a lot of you pretty damn angry as well. But the past is the past, and now we are moving forward aggressively, both NASA and SpaceX and other space agencies, towards the prize, towards Mars, towards Phobos, towards Deimos. And I am convinced that the moons of Mars, Mars Station Alpha, as I think we're going to keep calling it now, is going to be instrumental, absolutely crucial to our exploration and colonization of this planet. We can't do without it. And so in order to set up a base there, and in order to set up a logistical chain that involves these moons, we also need to understand them, the nature of them, their dangers, and the challenges that we're going to have to face before we can establish ourselves there and actually get something practical going. That having been said, you, of course, again, are seeing names scrolling across the screen. Can't stop it. There are quite a number of Patreon subscribers who have signed up over the last couple of weeks. I am recognizing them as I have promised. There are more benefits being offered to these supporters and more ways to support this channel. So, as I've said before, if you want this content to continue, go to the description. There are many ways to do so. And in the meantime, until we are getting ready to set down on Phobos or wherever we end up deciding to be our first destination on Mars or in its vicinity, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.